Hey everyone, welcome. Hey Andy,
Hello.
welcome. So happy to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. I want you to know that
Uh,
I am taking a break from my week-long vacation and Volkswagen restoration to be here for this very special event.
oh, well, thank you so much, but I feel like talking to us is a vacation anyway.
Woo!
Isn't having a fun conversation about page objects and screenplay relaxing?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Man.
How is your Volkswagen restoration going?
Dude, it's awesome. I'm trying to make the tweets with the pictures and stuff. So I completely gutted the interior. I started putting down sound barrier. It's called Hush Mat. This morning, my mom and I were able to get the headliner padding all complete on the roof and on the back. So this afternoon, we should be installing the new headliner.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, definitely keep sharing the pics on Twitter. It's cool to see progress of your work.
Thank you.
Hey Titus, welcome. Hey everyone, also welcome.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. We're gonna give about one more minute because this was scheduled to start at 12. I like to start a little bit early just to account for any technical difficulties, but we'll just hang out for a moment and wait for everyone else to join. We have a pretty large group joining us today, so should be a very exciting talk and a very exciting topic. And Andy has taken time away from his PTO to come have a conversation with us, so we're super grateful.
Glad to be here.
How are you doing, Titus? How is your move to Houston going?
Oh, I've got like a week and a half left here in Austin. So, it's like starting to get real. I've been here since 2005 for the most part. So it's gonna be a big change. But yeah, so that and keep them busy with a bunch of other things. So
Do you have everything figured out in terms of the move? You got your lease signed,
which
for
finally
your truck?
got a lease. It took way longer than it should because like, oh, we've got to move to another city, so you make several trips down there trying to find stuff. We finally agreed on something, and then they decided they're trying to sell the place as well as rent it, and so they tried to sneak in this 4-month clause where they could give us a 4-month notice to move out if they sold it. I'm like, no, I'm absolutely not doing that. I'm like, you could have told us this like a week and a half ago when we first expressed interest. So anyway, it's been all kinds of fun.
Well, I'm glad it's working out for you, and I hope you don't have many more surprises along the way.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, moving last minute to a different city is certainly not fun. Moving in general is not fun, but last minute is like extra stressful. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Nikolay, I'm a senior solutions architect here at Sauce Labs. Have been testing since 2008. And today we're joined by two awesome testing minds, Titus Fortner and Andy Knight, also known as Pandy. We're going to talk about page objects versus screenplay pattern. Some people like one or the other. Others like both. Some people like myself are unsure about either one. Hey, Pandy, sorry, we can hear you typing if you don't mind
Sorry.
muting. Thanks, buddy. Oh, no problem. No problem. So today we'll discuss the advantages and disadvantages of both patterns, see if we can create some kind of consensus among the community, see if we can create some kind of new ideas, some kind of new directions to move the test automation industry forward and give us better tests. So before we jump into the conversation, I quickly just wanted to mention how Twitter Spaces work. My feeling is a lot of us are new to Twitter Spaces. It's kind of a new feature that hasn't been around too long. Twitter Spaces works best on mobile. And the reason it works best on mobile is you get a bunch of little features that you can use whenever you want to interact with the speakers. This is meant to be a very interactive conversation. And so at the bottom right of your Twitter space, you'll have a little heart emoji to use. And then when you click it, you'll have a bunch of different emojis that you can use to support the speakers. You can clap, you can show hearts, you can show peace signs. and so on. So whenever the speakers are talking and you're kind of enjoying what they're saying, you can give them some encouragement, keep this a live, interactive conversation. That's kind of the goal of the Twitter space. All right. So with all of that said, let's jump into the guest introduction. So we're going to do guest introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about the basics of page object versus screenplay. And then we're actually going to jump into the conversation about which is preferred. Why should we one over the other? Should we use both? There's a lot of questions that we can go into here. So first I'd like to introduce Titus Fortner. Titus Fortner is on the technical leadership committee for Selenium and is the project lead for Water. He loves to give talks and teach workshops about how to create successful test automation solutions. Anything else you want to add, Titus?
As I find the right microphone button. No, that's good. I'm excited about this particular talk because I'm a huge proponent of abstracting things in a good way and thinking about things. And I think page objects are a good way to do that when they're done well. And so I'm excited to talk about doing page objects well as part of this discussion today.
Awesome. And Titus, where can people learn more about you just in case they want to keep up with all your amazing insights?
Yeah, so I'll tweet periodically at Titus Fortner on Twitter, and titusfortner.com is where I intermittently post things these days. So
awesome. And then on the other side of the friendly debate, we got Pandy Knight, who has so kindly joined us during his PTO because he likes to talk about automation much more than he enjoys relaxing. We have Andy Knight, also known as Pandy. He's the automation panda and a developer advocate at Applitools. He's the author of the upcoming book, The Way to Test Software for Manning Publishing. And he's also the lead developer for Boa Constrictor, the .NET Screenplay Pattern. Andy, anything else you want to add and let people know where they can find more information about you?
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah. So you can hit me up on Twitter at Automation Panda. You can find my blog at automationpanda.com, or you can come to your local Python or probably testing conference and you might see my bright, shiny face.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, guys. To keep things a little bit more fun and get the community to know a little bit more about you all, I wanted to do a rapid fire questions. I'll go one at a time. How about Andy? We'll do you first just to switch it up. So I'm just going to ask you a bunch of rapid fire questions and you give me the answer that fits best. Sounds good?
Let's do it.
All right. So what is your favorite food?
Oh my gosh. Some sort of Chinese food, authentic Chinese food.
All right. How about your favorite drink?
Oh, man. A nice cold red ale.
All right. And how about your favorite programming language?
Python.
All right. Awesome. All right, Titus, your turn.
Chicago pizza, West Coast IPA, and Ruby.
All right. For both of you, what is your favorite city in the world?
Oh, that's pain. Seattle?
All right. I've never been to Seattle. Heard good things.
Yeah, Seattle's a good pick. So I've only spent one day there, but I had such a good time that my fiance won't let me talk about it in Prague. So I haven't spent much time there, so it's not hard to say it's a long-term favorite city, but the most enjoyable 24 hours I've spent in the city was in Prague.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thanks, guys. All right, let's jump into the meat of this conversation. The way I wanted to structure it was first to talk about page objects and really kind of talk about what they are, their advantages, disadvantages, and then some good resources for learning more. And then we'll do the same thing about the screenplay pattern, kind of we're laying down the basic, and then we'll start talking about, which one is preferred, maybe both are preferred, maybe neither is preferred. This is meant to be kind of just like a brainstorming, a great conversation between a lot of very smart individuals to establish some good patterns, potentially create some new ideas for the industry. So Titus, since you're kind of the supporter of page objects, I'm going to start with you. maybe you can just give the audience high level overview of what is a page object, and then what do you believe is like a best pattern implementation of it, and maybe some advantages, disadvantages of page objects.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, coming from a Selenium background, Selenium is a very object-oriented approach to writing testing, and or for doing browser automation. And so doing page objects is kind of like an extension on top of that, where you're abstracting out information about a page or a section of a page into a class that allows you to kind of encapsulate behaviors. It's designed to essentially store information about locators that are on the page, as well as like the services the page provides. And one nice thing about page objects is it is for newer users, it provides a good way to kind of put a mental model of, I'm on this page when I'm viewing the website. That means the data or information about this page is stored in this file in this location in my test framework, kind of a thing. So it's kind of nice to have a one-to-one. And there are people that will talk both ways. Like, typically the Screenplay Pattern will argue that page objects are not sufficiently abstracted. And then on the other side, you'll have people complain that page objects are too abstracted. And obviously, I think there's a good case to be made for keeping things in the middle. We're keeping both the elements and the services on one page so that everything is stored together. And, you know, I think it fits into an overall, again, I don't necessarily think it's Screenplay versus page object for all contexts. I think there are contexts in which one or the other optimizes things. And so I prefer page objects when you're putting together a larger test suite. My philosophy is around very much, you should have short autonomous tests, which page objects lend themselves well to implementing. And it's pretty much a good, the use case is going to be for a larger test suite when you have a lot of different tests, a lot of people writing different tests in the same space. And yeah, so a good way to write down the database tests in an abstracted way. And I see it as part of you abstract out your view, which with page objects, you abstract out your test data and data objects. You provide an interface for interacting with the API in another set, and pack some data objects in between the page objects and the API interface. Like, I see it as kind of a part of a whole package, which allows you to kind of do automatic synchronization and do some other things with wrappers around the browser, the elements. So, like, by itself, I wouldn't say page objects are enough, but I think it's a really good building block for an overall testing strategy if you have a more complex setup.
Cool. Thanks so much for that overview. Definitely makes sense, Titus. And one other question I wanted to follow up with was, do you feel there are some like anti-patterns or kind of things you don't want people doing with page objects, or that you've seen that you hope that people would avoid?
I mean, oh, sure. Like, I had a whole talk on, here's 10 anti-patterns for page objects. Like, when a lot of people dismiss page objects or say page objects are bad, it's usually focusing on something that I agree that page object is bad. I think there are better ways to approach page objects than others, and some people will disagree with me on some of those, but things like, and so, you know, and part of it's also, you know, I was an SDAT at 5 different companies before I joined Sauce Labs, and then I've seen a whole bunch of different implementations from a whole bunch of different Sauce Labs clients. And partly, you know, my take on some of these. So one, my take on page objects does come from a Ruby background, which is a little different than Java, as I'm doing more Java. And also a lot of my takes come from, I've screwed it up several different ways at companies I've worked at. And so, like, I know you shouldn't do a page object this way, because when I did page objects that way, I ran into these problems. So I'm not a fan of coupling page objects. That's one standard practice, is to return an instance of another page object from a method in one page object. And I think that means you're storing the same information in both the test and in your abstraction. And I don't like it. I see why in Java it's like, oh, you get compile time information about your structure, but I'm not. I think it's easier to maintain without that. So a lot of my points for doing it have to do with maintenance costs. Like, we're really trying to optimize maintenance costs. We're trying to minimize we're trying to maximize how much information you're getting for the amount of resources that you have available, which means really focusing on cutting down maintenance costs. So coupling is probably my most controversial take, but there's a number of other things about, opinionated methods and doing automatic synchronization as part of your methods and trying to make sure you've got custom error messages and good stack traces, like all of these things that help improve maintenance costs. But that's like an entire hour talk. That there's some of it is online. If you search online for page objects and my name, you should see some of that.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna search for those resources and I'm gonna attach you to our thread here for the people. And I know that you and I, a few weeks back, we even did a whole talk about page objects and patterns and anti-patterns around that. So that'll be super useful as well. And then one other thing I want to say is I feel like a lot of us are, because we've messed up so many things at many different jobs and we learned along the way. So it's kind of nice to be here now sharing all of the mistakes that we've made and then hoping others don't make those same mistakes. Hey, Pandy, to you want to say about anything that Titus said relating to page objects?
Ooh, that's tempting. I mean, I've used page objects time and time again, sure. I like the fact that page objects are easy to get into. I think page objects can be suitable for smaller kinds of test automation projects. But I've also been in situations where page objects have just been absolutely terrible. Like where teams will write them poorly and then too far gone, and it just goes. People will just keep adding new methods on and on and on without refactoring. And it can be very, very bad. That's been my experience.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. I've seen, I would say, similar thing with a lot of stuff. Sorry, go ahead, Titus.
I have to say, I agree. There are a lot of bad page object implementations out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bad Selenium code out there. There's a lot of bad testing code out there. We're all trying to find patterns and ways to improve that. And there's definitely no silver bullet for any of this. So
I feel like let me know what I think. I feel like a lot of the bad implementation of patterns or abuse of different kind of techniques, I feel like a lot of the techniques, the ideas behind them can be good, but then the implementation of them, which a lot of times to me falls on a lack of good, thoughtful engineering. That's what is a lot of times the downfall of whether it's BDD, like in theory, BDD can be great, but then a lot of people don't do it well, or page objects, same thing. The idea is relatively simple, but then a lack of thoughtful engineering makes it really horrible. And so then that's where we get all these like horror stories, and rarely we get success stories about these patterns. What do you guys think?
One thing in particular that irks me with page objects is that there's really no conformity of design. I mean, it seems like to me, every time I've looked at a project that does page objects, it's implemented differently, right? I mean, some people, it's literally just plain old whatever objects with locators and action methods. Other places, they have this infamous base page that everybody's inheriting from. And so it's very freeform. And in a lot of these designs, there's nothing to force people to do things a certain way, or to from the framework or the design pattern itself, to enforce those good practices that you would want. And so people can just fill these page objects with questionable things, and then it spreads all over. That's one of the things that has always irked me with page objects, because if you read, for example, the Gang of Four's design patterns, it's like those design patterns kind of force you to do something a particular way. There's protections in place. Page object, there's like no protections.
Hey, Titus, do you want to get in a word? And I was going to say, if you do, go ahead. If not, maybe we can move on to screenplay pattern, get a little bit of basics around that before we start bagging on each of these patterns.
Sorry, having some technical difficulties here. Go ahead and dig into the screenplays. I'm sure we can talk more about patterns and good usage as we go on.
Sounds good. Thanks, Titus. Yeah, Pandy, since you are, I would say, one of the leaders on the screenplay pattern, can you give us a little bit of background about what it is, what is the idea behind it, some best practices around it, and if you have some good resources you can share with us that I can drop into the Twitter thread for everybody, that'll be awesome.
Sure, absolutely. So the screenplay pattern at its heart is a design pattern for modeling interactions. Those interactions could be with a web page, it could be with a mobile app, it could be with an API, a command line, it could be accessing a database, accessing config files, whatever. Whereas page objects are very much some sort of page structure, like a web page or even a mobile page. Screenplay is much broader in that sense. It's not supposed to be necessarily like an alternative to page objects. It's meant to be a more comprehensive way of handling automated interactions. And so what I tell people is the design of the screenplay pattern is this one line. Actors use abilities to perform interactions. I'll say it again. Actors use abilities to perform interactions. In the screenplay pattern, we have the separation of concerns. The actor is the initiator of the interactions. That could, let's say, be like a human, a user, but it could also be some sort of other caller, like if there's an entity out there calling an API or something. The actor is the starting point. Abilities are tools that help you get your job done. So, for example, if you're doing web UI types of interactions, you would need a tool like Selenium WebDriver or like Playwright or Puppeteer, right? That the tool would be the thing that the actor is using in order to accomplish the interaction. And so if we're going to stick within like a web UI kind of context, an actor could be a user, an ability could be something like Selenium WebDriver, and the interactions could be things like clicking, getting text, or selecting something from a dropdown. Those are all low-level kind of, but then they could also be much more complex interactions. Things like, well, I need to log into an application, or I need to upload a profile picture, or I need to fill out a particular form, right? Those are higher level interactions that are composed of lower level interactions. And so screenplay pattern is a way that you can write those higher level interactions with the reusability of the lower level interactions and all the safety features built in. So when you would be coding up calls in the screenplay pattern, typically they're going to read something like this. Actor dot attempts to click on a particular locator. Actor attempts to send keys to a particular locator with a particular text field. Or for the higher level ones, it could be something like actor attempts to log in as an admin. Actor attempts to navigate to the homepage. Actor attempts to upload their profile picture. And when I say these things out, it may sound like I'm speaking pseudocode or comment. The screenplay pattern, if you depending on the language it's implemented in, you can make it have fluent like syntax that reads along. There might just be some parentheses and dots in the way. So that's another aspect of it. I have done screenplay pattern at my previous company, Precision Lender /Q2. In fact, at that company, we built up a very large test automation project together. It would run, thousands of tests continuously, which is really nice. You can read about it. If you Google how Q2 uses BDD and SpecFlow, you'll find the article I wrote on the whole project. But the cornerstone of that project was boa constrictor, which is the .NET screenplay pattern that we implemented. When I joined PL 4 years ago, it was a Microsoft .NET shop. So we did our test automation .NET. And so I went looking for a good screenplay implementation in .NET. And I couldn't find it. So I made it. And eventually that became the boa constrictor project. So Nikolay, I know you asked for resources. I would recommend if you Google boa constrictor screenplay, you'll hit our GitHub repository, our GitHub docs page. You might even find some videos out there. In a lot of those resources, I explain not only how you use Screenplay and how it works, but also then how do you use it with boa constrictor specifically.
Perfect. Thanks, Pandy. Actually, I already had that resource ready because I think that's what I know it really well for is the .NET implementation of boa constrictor. And then what was the other resource you mentioned about how Q2 tests?
Oh, yeah. So let me see how Q2 uses BDD and SpecFlow. If you just Google that, you'll find the Automation Panda article pop up. This was a case study that I wrote in collaboration with Q2 and Census on how we at Q2 use these tools and these processes for testing the precision lender application. And it's kind of like a high level overview case study, but I show like, here's how we did BPD, here's how we wrote a test, here's how we ran them, living doc, boa constrictors in there. So it kind of gives the context of this is where it fits in a whole project.
Okay. Sounds great. Thanks. Hey, Titus, do you have anything to say about what Andy said?
Trying to think through some of the back and forth here, because like we're talking about different ways to separate concerns was part of it, and the whole screenplay approach of focusing as an actor and kind of working on a flow through this stuff. And I am not super familiar with the boa constrictor specifically. Does that require using SpecFlow?
Oh, no, not at all. Boa constrictor is a standalone implementation of Screenplay. So the idea is it has the core pattern, the actor, the abilities, the questions and tasks. You can use it with any kind of test framework you want, NUnit, XUnit.NET, SpecFlow, or just as scripting or console app. It's meant to be that standalone thing, so it doesn't force you to bring in other specific projects.
Okay, because I have a whole separate consideration for my frustrations with BDD tools specifically, but we'll try and keep that out of this conversation. I think we both were talking about like the difference between declarative and imperative test writing. Both Screenplay and page objects can be written either. And actually, this is one of my things with, I think, good page objects. Well, let's back up. Bad page objects are only storing locators and require you to use Selenium commands in the tests themselves. So that is when I get this element and I click it and I do whatever. I don't think that that's a very good use of page objects. I want all of the Selenium implementation code to be abstracted into a page object. And so I think we're agreeing that that's a good way to do it. I think one of my concerns with both BDD and Screenplay Pattern is that it kind of encourages a more brittle, lower level imperative test writing approach. And I'm not saying you can't do a higher level with either of these. I just think that some of these tools do more to encourage that approach than others. And the more that you are focused on the imperative things, the harder it is to maintain. And again, that works for both bad page object implementations as well. I also see the approach for both of these, and again, it's weird because I'm having to argue bad what is like a really good screenplay implementation is going to be better than a bad page object implementation, and vice versa. And so it's kind of hard to really separate out what is a good page object implementation, what is a good screenplay implementation, and really compare like the best of both of those. Because if you start things bad, it's going to get worse, right? So when Andy says that he thinks page objects make sense for a smaller project, and I think they only make sense for a larger project, a lot of that has to do with how badly did you set things up at the beginning, so that adding more and more things makes things more and more complicated and makes things harder to maintain. Another thing I like to say is that the best framework in the world is useless if people don't want to use it. And so like context dependent here. If everyone agrees that, oh my gosh, I've had a horrible experience with page objects, you're less likely to work on a good implementation of page objects and use it well. So if we're trying to just talk like theoretically, what can a page object do versus what Screenplay can do, I think Screenplay also forces you into this kind of coupling idea that I don't like as much, because you have to be like, this actor does this thing, with these, does with these resources this thing, kind of an approach, and that ends up coupling things in a way that I find less maintainable. And I guess the other big issue I have with Screenplay is, and BDD again, is that it kind of takes a user approach. So let me back up. I think that the transition from manual testing to automated testing makes BDD feel good. It makes Screenplay feel good because you are an actor, you have certain resources, you're doing certain things. I feel like that's a very manual tester approach to getting into testing, and that's not bad. But I think it's limiting. I think that you're only thinking about things as if the way that a manual tester would think about things. You're not actually going to get all of the benefit that a manual tester gets when they do their testing, and you're not getting everything you could from automated tests. I really feel like to get the most out of automated tests, you need to have a super parallelized, atomic, autonomous, short test suite, which is something that journeys and the Screenplay pattern itself tend to discourage, where you can do that better with a page object approach. And again, I don't actually care. Like, a user of a website is a user, like whether it's the admin or an end user or whoever it is, the actor of that page object is implicit. Like, so defining it, I don't think adds additional value. And honestly, I really don't care about a user filling out a form necessarily. I care that the form works. And so even phrasing it as from the standpoint of the user, I feel like is missing the point of the test itself. I'm trying to test that this works, this works, this works. And so what resources I'm bringing in or who the actor is, I feel is mostly superfluous to the way that I see a large-scale testing initiative to be providing the most value to the company.
Man, I completely disagree with everything you just said. So I disagree with the point about loose coupling. I disagree with the point about that Screenplay encourages, or it's a bridge for manual testing. If I can dig in a little bit into the separation of concerns there, actor, ability, and interaction. From the top level, the outside looking in, yes, it is phrased as, some sort of test you're going through that could be, you could say, manual friendly. But in my view, it's the declarative stating of, these are the steps I want to take in my test. Also, I should say, Screenplay, BDD, we should be treating those as completely separate, because you can use Screenplay pattern apart from any test framework. So as I am formulating steps, right, and I'm thinking about the things I want to do, I can make interactions to handle those kinds of steps, whether it's like login, navigate to this page, whatever. You can make higher level interactions, those more complex ones, or you could just keep it to the lower level simple things like click, scrape, send text, all that. So from that aspect, in terms of the coupling of things, the whole point of Screenplay is to make sure that you can separate your concerns and have that loose coupling, that you're following solid principles. That you're not going back and editing things that are shared a lot, that you're adding on kinds of things. The whole actor and ability is so that you can have an initiator object that you can either dynamically add things to or not add. If I'm doing a web UI and a REST API test, I can say actor can browse the web with this particular Chrome driver. Actor can call REST API with this particular REST client. And so you can add those per test as you need them, or not add them. And anytime you add those abilities, it is essentially adding more capability to do certain kinds of interactions. And so that you could add, basically, or you can, the interactions are not tied to the actor or the ability. They're completely separate again. So you could have like a basic set of WebDriver based interactions. You could use those to build higher level interactions. Or at the same time, I could go and add a whole library of Playwright interactions that is completely separate from the WebDriver ones, but the actor doesn't change. The abilities don't change, and any interactions I had before don't need to change, and they're completely unaffected. So that allows this great developer scalability with your pattern. Again, this is not purely just modeling pages. This is how do we handle interactions at large? And as far as this going to scale well for a high parallel test suite full of small atomic tests that can be fast, I would say yes, because that's exactly what we did. And that's what I wrote in that case study that we shared before. I found that Screenplay was an incredible way to not only implement this interaction layer, but also to keep these interactions safe, right? You know, if you're just using raw WebDriver, we all know the weighting problem, right? With the Screenplay interactions, I can easily add the automatic weighting around that. So when I say like bow constrictors click, it's going to make sure that element is on the page before I go to click it. Versus if I'm just using raw WebDriver and I say click, then it's like, oh, there's danger there. There's race condition, and there could be a lot of flakiness. So making all of the interactions in my test suite, the bow constrictor wrappers of these interactions, kept everything super safe, super stable, not flaky at all. And you might think, well, Andy, your test suite had like 1,000+ tests in it. Did that mean you had like 1,000+, different classes for interaction? Not really. I mean, most of the interactions we were using were the low-level kinds of bow constrictor interactions around WebDriver. We probably had order of magnitude, maybe like 100 custom interactions for a suite of like 1,000 to 2,000 tests, which I was actually surprised at that. I thought there would have been more, but we kept it fairly maintainable. We found that it was an uncommon circumstance when we would need to write a completely new interaction, that we could just use the pattern with what it already had. So we found it to be very scalable, very performant, had the benefits of both good declarative calls as well as very nice dependency injection behind the scenes with the actor and the abilities to enable new interactions. And we didn't have to constantly be editing the same kind of code over and over again that could branch out and affect everybody. You need a new thing, you add it on, it doesn't affect what was there before.
What percentage of users that use a Screenplay pattern would you say are also using a BDD pattern? I get that yours is agnostic, but all of the stuff that I have seen with Screenplay has mixed those.
Yes.
So like the things that frustrate me about BDD, I get that there's kind of a, like, oh, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about with Screenplay. But at the same time, when most of your users are using it in one way, it's a little difficult to say, oh, but they're not doing it the way that they could necessarily.
I can appreciate this point because I think we have to understand a bit of the history of Screenplay here, right? When Screenplay first hit the scene as Screenplay, we're talking this is around like 2013, 2012-ish. The original folks around it were also very much BDD folks. Folks like John Ferguson Smart, and I can't remember some of their other names. I can see their face. But anyway, they put out the Screenplay Pattern. And so to this day, if you search for Screenplay Pattern articles, you're probably finding that original set of articles from like 2013, 2014, also very tied to Serenity BDD. And so they were very much connected with it. And for the longest time, the only major implementation of Screenplay was Serenity BDD, whether Java or JavaScript. We didn't really see any others come about. And like it was kind of the thing of like, well, if you want to do this, then you kind of have to take that whole giant all-in-one framework. And a lot of people embraced it, drank the Kool-Aid, loved it. Their whole world was that. But a lot of other people were like, man, I just want this narrow little slice. I already have my project set up. I don't need the whole do-over thing. When I came out with Boa Constrictor, when we released it publicly in 2020, one of my goals was to make it a standalone. I was trying to like blaze a new trail, so to speak. So I understand what you're saying. Like, yeah, a lot of times it is tied to BDD. Yeah, it is. I kind of had a unique perspective of what I was trying to do. to make it that standalone thing. So here we
So yes. So there we go. So like my bias against BDD approaches in general is spilling over into kind of my frustration that I had seen with spec flow implementation. I applaud you in putting something together that is independent of BDD requirement. And so I'll try to do my best to differentiate between those two concepts as we're talking about it here.
Well, thank you.
It's still at the same time, one of the things when you're coming from an actor resources action kind of approach, don't you find that lends itself well to a more journey approach of testing, where you're testing a bunch of like a flow rather than a specific functionality?
You can do that, but you don't need to.
But this is the distinction I want to make. Does it encourage it? Because one of my frustrations with BDD is I feel like it's not like you'll have the blog post saying, don't do this. You've got, ASLAC and people say, this is the wrong way to use BDD. But yet 90% of people use it that way because that's the way that makes the most sense, because it kind of actively encourages that behavior. And so this is what I'm trying to like differentiate. If you're trying to differentiate patterns between what does a page object pattern do and what does Screenplay do, is what are they actively encouraging? And I do think that page objects, to a certain, one of the critiques of a page object, it could be that they actively encourage you to use it to store locators instead of doing both locators and services. But I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but that's one critique just because that's how a lot of people are using them. And so I'm trying to get out in my question as we're trying to compare these things is, what potential issues does Screenplay actively encourage that might not be what people blogging about Screenplay would say is the ideal way to use it?
Honestly, I'm not sure, because in my take on Screenplay, I haven't seen enough other people to be able to say, oh, that's where you screwed up.
Well, so how long were your tests, the tests that you had? Did they kind of flow through the app, or were they focused on, does this framework, does login work, does can you edit this subject in the page?
We were not doing lengthy end-to-end tests. We were atomic individual behaviors. So it's like, okay, you get the app in the state you want, and then you exercise a behavior like, okay, let me try to price this loan real quick. Boom, boom. Did it do what it said? Yes or no? Okay. Bail out, log, done, move on to the next test. So we kept the tests fairly short. You could have written very lengthy end-to-end tests with Screenplay. We did not do that. You could write it with. I wouldn't say that in that sense, Screenplay is biasing you towards lengthier tests, right? Because you would still have to do a lot of work to put those longer workflows together, which would be no different than if you were using a page object model.
Well,
it doesn't.
I would say that's fair. I guess I would say it kind of, and again, this is kind of where the BDD Screenplay bleed over happens. Is I feel like BDD does encourage testers to copy paste their test cases, that the 10,000 test cases that the manual testers were executing every month-long build cycle versus trying to get the same functionality or the same utility out of a different approach to doing test automation. So anyway, I applaud what you've done, and I think using that as an example is a good thing. I'm a little concerned just in general that when people get into the mindset of thinking, when I do X, it gets them thinking about a longer string of things. Also, I'm going to get on my high horse and my soapbox again, so I probably expect this. I do not like the term end-to-end because it's confusing. Developers and testers mean different things when they say that. Developers think of end-to-end as a full daunted database evaluation of functionality, and testers tend to think about a journey where you're walking through the site. And that's how you're using it in this case. When we're talking about flows, we're talking about like when the user starts here and does this and moves on to the next thing, that kind of a thing. And so I try to differentiate when I'm talking about them. And again, I'm like the lone person shouting in the void and trying to change long-standing usage. But daunted database for talking about evaluating a full stack, and then a flow or a journey for talking about how testers tend to approach it. Just because I find that when the different roles are communicating with each other, there's often a disconnect that people don't even realize there's a disconnect. Anyway, soapbox done.
Good points. Good. It's always good to clarify terms.
Hey, Andy, just a question for you about something you've said. By the way, I'm trying to be as non-biased as possible, which I don't think I actually have a bias towards either one of these patterns. I've used page objects throughout my career simply because back in the day, when we were all doing test automation, that was kind of the default standard that people picked up, right? So I've done them as I've advanced in my testing skills and learned how to test applications beyond the UI and be able to touch all the layers. One of the disadvantages I found with page objects is that inherently they limit it into a UI first implementation, right? I mean, you're literally interacting with a UI and then performing some actions. And then I ran into an issue where if I wanted to convert my UI test into, let's say, an API test, or I wanted to test the same functionality with unit test, I now had to not only rewrite the test, I also had to, of course, implement the logic underneath it as well. And so that was to me like, this doesn't seem right. Why am I changing my test, which is supposed to represent kind of end user behavior requirements, when really the only thing I'm changing is how validate supposed to be doing. So that's my challenge with page objects. And then Screenplay Pattern, I have a few qualms with it as well, in that I find it hard to use and complicated. So I just wanted to say that up front. You guys can comment on it if you want, just to kind of show that I'm trying to be a non-biased host here. But my question to you, Andy, after that long explanation, was you were talking about doing an atomic test with Screenplay Pattern. And I want to understand more of what does that look like? I saw some of your examples where you were doing a UI test, you were doing an API test. But so what if it was something more atomic? Let's say, you're going to be testing a login form and you've already previously tested the UI login in another test. How would you now test, for example, that the login form returns a negative response with invalid users or something like that, something more atomic? How does that look in Screenplay Pattern terms?
Sure. So it's a good thing you asked this, because the way you have pitched it to me, if I were using boa constrictor, doesn't matter what the test framework is, and I were to do the negative login case, let me try to put in a bad username, password, try it 3 times and see if it locks me out. Honestly, I would be writing a test case, just making the low, or I would be using the basic interactions. I would be saying something like, actor navigates to myapp.com, actor attempts to send keys, my username, actor attempt to send keys, bad password, actor attempt to click, actor waits until error message appears and have a question checking for that error message. That's basically all I would do, right? It doesn't fundamentally change necessarily how you write your test. It's just the calls that you're making, instead of going through page objects, would be going through Screenplay calls, right? And so you would have your page locators in one class over to the side, and then you would have your click, your send keys, your question to get a particular field on the page separate, and then you'd be tying them together with the actor attempting to or asking for things. That's how it would. I don't think I would be making any sort of grander, more complex custom interaction to navigate through, because I don't need to, right? The basic kinds of interactions are good enough.
Yeah, and I think I'm in a simpler boat. But I want to I want to kind of push back on what you were saying earlier, Nikolay. You and I are kind of disagreeing on part of this, and I think the root of our disagreement is that you're seeing less value in Lambda database tests in general, and so you're kind of applying that we don't need large DOM to database test suites, and so we can do smaller tests and then switch out different layers to test the same thing. I actually think that is that a fair assessment before I
Yeah, Titus, that's a fair assessment. Basically, as
okay.
I'm advancing in my testing skills, yeah, I'm realizing less value. I mean, it's almost like, to me, the crux of it is, if we're trying to apply one of the many pyramids that exist in the world, right? We've got so many variations of it now, but a lot of them ultimately kind of push towards more lower level tests, less UI tests, and a bunch of other types of tests, whether it's unit tests, component tests, integration tests, visual tests are getting added to that pyramid now. All of those tests combined, and then there are UI tests. It's, that's my concern there, is that then page objects become cumbersome and create a rigid structure to my tests that I don't know if I want to have.
Yeah, that's fair. And so my pushback on that is going to be, I still firmly believe that DOM to database tests are essential and are going to remain essential to having the digital confidence we need in our applications at a large layer. And I think one of the things that the three of us can get into a problem with, and Andy's actually speaking to a real world situation, which is good. But I think we can get tied up into our little demos that we put together, right? We get to the point where we become, speakers and advocates and evangelists, and then we start showing off little demos of things. And it's a lot easier to kind of show a demo of something than it is to speak to larger scale implementations, which is why I'm glad that Andy's speaking to his last company at this point. But and you're absolutely right. If you're not working with the DOM, if you're not interacting with the page, then page objects don't make sense. The pushback I have is that, one, I think it's important that we have that layer, and I think it's important that we have a lot of that layer. I do think it should be maintainable, but that's really where the rubber meets the road as far as, does something work? It has to work from the DOM through the API, through the service layer, to the database, and back. I actually don't think you're testing the right things if you're testing the same thing with the UI as you are with an API. So, for instance, we talked about the login, and Amy brought up that, the testing it 3 times. I would never test that with Selenium. I would test to make sure that the login form, is composing the right, JSON block to send to the right endpoint, so that it results in the setting of the state that we're interested in. I would then have a separate test in an API test suite that sends that JSON block to that endpoint 3 times and see what response I get back. Because that's actually testing that part of the functionality, rather than, this is why I want to focus on, does the form do what I want it to do? And it's separate from, does the state behavior change in the backend? And so this idea that we should take the same test suite that we execute from the UI and test the exact same things with the API, I think is both redundant and excessive and missing the point for a lot of the things that we're trying to do. My test pyramid that I still haven't written a blog post about, actually argues that unit tests are overrated, because I think you do need to see how systems are working together in order to get the maximum information for the amount of people resources that we're putting into something. So again, minimizing maintenance costs, maximizing the amount of information you're getting, not for how long it takes to execute something, because I don't really care about execution time unless it gets past a certain amount. I care about giving good feedback to the developer. And I think if you over rely on unit tests, you're not actually getting all of the information that you need, and you actually can be spending more time maintaining your unit tests, if they're written properly, than you would a good integration test, and not getting the same value from it. So that's kind of my big pitch for page objects solve a specific need. I think that needs valuable, and I think if you're trying to conflate it with other types of tests, you're not getting what you need from your overall testing strategy.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I don't think that DOM to database, also known as by a lot of people end-to-end tests, I think they belong as part of our testing, tool belt of tools that we want to use in our testing of our software. So definitely don't disagree there. I'm just putting myself in the shoes of, and as that an automation engineer, even a developer that is working on testing some software. And what I found a lot of times, unless it's like greenfield implementation that's happening, a lot of people will still start at the DOM to database test just because they tend to be, I think, the easiest to implement because you don't need to know as much about the internals of the software that you're testing. And so in your example where you were talking about, testing the login, which I 100% agree with that, right? The way I would have tested is the same thing as you make sure there's a connection between the UI and the back end by interacting with the UI. And then everything afterwards, you implement at a lower level layer, like a API, to ensure that you're getting the proper responses and getting back the proper objects and so on. So, but to me, the issue there is that if you start from a page objects implementation, then what you've written is a positive login test. And then you've written a negative, let's say a negative login test also with page objects. And now your page object is logging in, passing in a negative user and a negative password. And then you're getting back some sort of a response. And so then when you want to move that down to a different layer, you have to get rid of all the work that you did and replace it with a totally separate API test. If you were doing it smarter, right? If you were kind of trying to do the more atomic, faster test. And to me, that's a concern, because why can't we do this correctly from the start by thinking about our tests in a smarter manner? And to me, actually, that's one of the interesting things about a potential of something like the screenplay pattern or the potential of BDD. Titus, I know you and I aren't definitely not huge on BDD, but the potentials of them to kind of represent the end user behavior in an English-like syntax that can then simply just change the implementation details when you're ready to change the implementation details while keeping the test intact. That to me is attractive. And actually, I haven't seen any really good implementations of it besides one that Aslak Helsoy did. I've got to find this webinar, but he did a presentation where he used Cucumber and he wrote some tests for an application, and he was able basically to run the same tests across different layers of the system, whether it was unit, integration, or UI, simply by flipping command line flags, but it was the same test, just using different layers of the system. And to me, that made sense. And especially in terms of, moving down a better path to testing, that's kind of what I feel like we need to figure out is what is that pattern, or can we do it better so that we don't have to destroy our tests in order to have a better implementation? What do you guys think?
Well, I guess I don't see as much reuse as you do between the interactions that you would get from pages versus APIs. Like, my API tests are going to be a lot more about evaluating schemas and then trying to send different data objects to it. And so I guess to a certain extent, I could reuse some of the data objects. And you see my, the frameworks that I put together that make heavy use of APIs to set state and do validation. And so like from that standpoint, I'm using APIs, but like a full API test suite, I think if you're not evaluating schemas and you're just going to end up hard coding a bunch of stuff that theoretically isn't capturing everything that you're going to want, and things can change that will break things that you won't detect. And so from like a test pyramid standpoint, I'm absolutely encouraged. In a lot of places, testers don't even have access to the implementation details or the code base in general. And that's a mistake, and the industry is kind of moving away from that, but that's just the reality for, I would even say at this point, most testers and most QA departments. And so, but testers and QA all have access to any API that's put in place. And so if you have access to that API, you should absolutely be using that in coordination with page objects. It's not an either or. You should be setting state and doing validations, and and a lot of that is set state with the API and then validate that the DOM is showing what you expect for the application being in the state that it's in. And so I don't see how you can do just API tests without also including the DOM in a lot of those things. I'm not sure you get the complete picture, the complete information. And again, I know Azlak has that specific context where he's running all three, really fast in a straight comparison. And I just think at a larger scale with a different context, it's not going to make sense to run the same test at different layers, because you fundamentally want, like, your unit tests are designed, are the inputs and outputs for my methods doing what I want? And that's completely different from does this form do what I want? Does this, the drop down set the state that I expect from it? So I don't know, Andy, how do you feel about this from a screenplay perspective?
Well, one very nice thing about Screenplay is that since it is an interactions pattern, you can have Web UI and REST API together. So for example, like if we were talking about that login thing earlier, a really cool thing you could do is, let's say as part of your setup, you need to authenticate into your application. You could use a REST API interaction to perform login, get your token, smack that into your Selenium WebDriver as a cookie, and then boom, now your Web UI ability, so to speak, is ready to roll. Screenplay makes that very, very easy with this dependency injection mechanism. So that's one aspect of, hey, you can do these things together. Now, as far as what's appropriate, do we want to run the same test at every level? I think what Aslak did is cool. Wow. In theory, you could do something like that. Though from a test project implementation standpoint, Titus, I think I'm kind of with you in that I would want my different tests at different layers to be doing different things, and I wouldn't want them to be doing things redundantly, right? So like there's a big difference between testing code and testing features. Your unit test should be testing code, right? Your black box test should be testing features. So like, do I want like when I'm planning my tests, I kind of like what you were saying before. Maybe I have a one positive and one negative login test at the UI level, but then I try all my different combinations of negative cases at an API level, and I split those apart, and I take a little bit of risk in doing that, but I believe it's worthwhile. I believe enough risk is mitigated that I can feel confident in knowing that the behaviors are going to work as expected, and save myself the time of development and execution of those tests. So I do agree with that.
Yeah, I really see this as, again, optimizing for maintenance costs, right? Like, you might be losing a little bit by doing things a certain way, but you're actually making up for it by giving reliable results in a much more scalable way. And I also want to point out, I actually think yours and my approach is surprisingly similar in a lot of these things, just with different tools.
Well, if I may say, when it comes to page objects and Screenplay, you could argue Screenplay Pattern is a merciless, solid refactoring of page objects. You could say that.
Yeah, I do think that people make a bigger deal about solid than they should. Like, I've heard, was it Mark that gave that talk at Selenium Conf a number of years ago, like focusing on solid and the solid principles. And I actually think it's overdone. My concern is not how computer science correct something is, it's how easy it is to maintain. What I'm hearing from you is that you put together a Screenplay implementation that avoids some of the problems I have with BDD, that is able to do, and the way that you're actively using it, at least how you did at your last company, is avoiding some of the problems that I have with bad page object implementations. Like you're talking about, like, setting state and whatever. Like, my page object approach is going to be login API dot login, and then login page dot, submit, like login successfully, whatever that is, right? And then all of the implementation details I'm putting in the page object for what is a valid user and what is the locators and what things does Selenium need to do to put the data and the locators together to get what we want. And and some of the stuff that I find useful about page objects is kind of the way. And again, I look at this. Let's take a data object, pass it into a page object, and have the page object figure out what to do with that data to interact with the page the way that makes sense. And let's pass that data object to an API interface. Like my approach to page objects is very REST oriented. It really is, which is one of the reasons why GraphQL frustrates me, is because it changes the paradigm completely. So, my approach to page objects would not be as useful if you're doing if you have a GraphQL interface. But yeah, essentially passing around inputs and outputs of the same chunk of data, or again, permutations of data straight through the API, and then measuring that the data goes in and the data comes out the right way, both through the UI and the API. And there's ways, again, when you abstract this out and you do a lot of these things, you can do automatic synchronization, with wrappers. You can do, if you name your data object keys the same as your page object elements, then it can all be automatic. And again, this comes from a very Ruby standpoint as an implementation. I did put together a page object, data object, API object implementation that was built on top of Water, that never quite had an opportunity to flesh it out. I was kind of perfecting it when I got to the company before Soft Labs. And then, the more you do with Soft Labs, the more it's all Java or JavaScript, but I mostly focus on Java, and just my beloved Ruby is dying off in popularity. But one of the things, if I had unlimited free time, would be to try and create a reusable page object strategy in Java, or page object tools in Java, that kind of do the good practices and encourage the things that I'm promoting here. But back to just our conversation, it sounds like we're taking a very similar approach using different tools and both kind of focusing on the maintainability of it. So it's just interesting to me that we kind of have similar ideas on what is maintainable, and then are coming at it from two different approaches. And then we both recognize that there's a whole bunch of really bad implementations of our tools on either side.
I agree with that. I would still strongly favor Screenplay, because I feel like it does force you into making better decisions, whereas Page Object to me still feels much more freeform. Something that I have found, and something that I believe share with others, is when it comes to a test automation project, I like the code to be as homogeneous as possible. I don't like it when I can tell who wrote which tests, right? I want everybody to kind of conform to a particular style, to a particular convention. And when that happens, people adopt that and continue to do that. It becomes very easy to maintain the test suites. It becomes very easy to maintain the internal plumbing when you have those abstracted layers of architecture within your project, to know that, okay, I have the tests up here. I have those, if you're doing BD step definitions, I have my interaction layer with Screenplay, I have my lower level plumbing of like logging, whatever. It becomes very, very easy to continue to support that project, to bring people on, to, manage it, send out different tasks to different people on your team, because everything is the same. And when people come to see it, if something is unique or different or special or doesn't conform, it's like, what the heck is going on here? And you have to spend extra mental energy trying to figure that out. And I believe Screenplay, because of its conformity of design of how you're supposed to do interactions, and in most test projects, depending on your language, you can put the forces in place to force people to actually, no, you have to do it this way. You can't do it another way. That makes the burden much, much lighter.
And I don't think that that's inherently a Screenplay benefit over page objects. Because, I mean, you're talking to a Ruby dev who's all about conventions, and I think it's just as easy to put specified conventions in place with the page object pattern. You're just abstracting different things. I'm abstracting here's where the data goes, here's where the pages go, here's where the API interface goes, here's where your declarative tests go, kind of a thing. And
let me give an example of this based on things I've seen. So within the big thing that I'm thinking about here is like waiting, right? You have to wait for a button to appear on the page before you can click it. And with the screenplay pattern, when you use boa constrictors click, it does that automatically for you, which is really nice. If you're doing what I would call a quote unquote typical page object pattern from what I've seen, when you go to, whatever form page or login page, and you write the method to click that button, usually what people do in that method is they are making the raw WebDriver calls there, and they may or may not include the safety check for that wait before that button is there.
Again, that's an implementation detail. That has nothing to do with pattern you're using.
Bear with me. Right. Within a project that is doing page object, right? The expectation is that you as the developer are going to have to go write this method. And every time before you interact with it, you're going to have to put the explicit wait there. Or you're going to have to call some sort of like base page click that does that for you, and you're going to have to remember to do that. Bring new people in the project that may not be aware of that. They may be putting in whatever raw calls in there, and that makes it very shaky. Whereas within the screenplay thing, there is no way for you to really get to the raw WebDriver thing. You have no choice but to use the click that is provided to you from boa constrictor. I mean, I guess you could really do a big song and dance around it, right? But it's very much pulled away from you. So you have this force on the situation that is pushing you to do the right thing. Whereas what I have seen in most page object implementation is that you don't have that same level of force to do the right thing.
But that's an implementation specific thing. That's something you've done in boa constrictor. That's something that I built in to water by default, all of the water stuff. And I would even say that a better pattern is not to check to make sure if something's displayed, is to actually make the call and then deal with the results, because that's more performant. But I have put a lot of time and energy into finding the most performant ways to do synchronization for testing purposes. But that's abstracted into element wrappers in water. You don't have to see any of that in my page objects. And again, we're talking about the implementations of page objects versus good implementations of page objects versus good implementations of screenplay, rather than something that I think is inherent to screenplay versus inherent to page objects. It's like if you need a global waiting strategy rather than having to write it every single time. And I actually don't have it for click and for every, all of the code for the waiting logic happens in one place. It doesn't exist in every single action type of a thing. So there are ways to do it well in either of these patterns.
Okay. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced.
I mean, one of the problems I've had is that there isn't an equivalent of water in Java, for instance. And if I had the time to put something together, it would be a page object, data object, API object, water, wrapper implementation in Java. There are some Java tools that are out there that, I don't know, do different things that I haven't been able to find one that approaches page object implementation. So again, this is something that someone could write at their company without any real issues. And again, most of the page objects I've seen do have clicks at the base page level, and I would argue that putting a bunch of things in the base page is not ideal either. But I don't think that it's inherent to screenplay that things get put in one place but don't get put in page objects. Most developers are looking for ways to abstract out common logic. And again, there are a lot of bad page object implementations. I just don't see it as an inherent flaw in page objects as a pattern. And again, and that comes from the object-oriented part, right? Like when you have common things, you find ways to abstract them out. And there are good ways and poor ways of abstracting them out, or more maintainable or less maintainable ways. But it's a very object-oriented approach, is to take repeating patterns and put them somewhere. And if you have bad developers writing bad frameworks, you're not going to have the synchronization you need, or you're going to have hard-coded weight. So you're going to put a lot of things in different places. And I think you're speaking to your tool more than you are the pattern itself.
Hey, Andy, sorry to interrupt. Before you answer, I wanted to make sure we leave time for Q&A from everyone from the audience as well. So if you want to ask a question to Titus or Andy or both, you can use the little heart emoji at the bottom of your mobile app and then just raise your hand, and then I will make you speaker at some point when I see you, and then you'll be able to ask questions to Titus or Andy. And Andy, I think I see what Titus is saying here, and maybe the way to clarify this is to ask a question here is, I see that what Titus is saying is basically that the differences so far to me sound like where Screenplay maybe has an advantage over page objects in terms of talking about our implementation details. And if done well, then those differences kind of disappear and the advantages of Screenplay Pattern disappear. And so maybe the question to ask here is, in your opinion, Andy, what do you think? Imagine a good page objects implementation that has the qualities that you are talking about that Screenplay Pattern also has. How does Screenplay help to avoid the missteps that the page object pattern does not allow us to avoid? Or you were talking about Screenplay basically forcing us into a better implementation while page objects allowing us a more loose implementation. How does that happen?
Yeah. So gathering thoughts. I think there were two questions in there, Nikolay. The latter one was, how does Screenplay force you into a particular kind of implementation? And that's through its dependency injection behind the scenes, where you kind of ask certain things. It encourages you to use the interactions that are there rather than trying to break open and make raw WebDriver calls or whatever kind of calls. So that's the main point I was trying to make there, was to say, like, the Screenplay is a somewhat opinionated approach, and it puts you on guide rails, and the guide rails are there to help you. Now, as far as like, if you compare good page objects versus good Screenplay, what advantages then does Screenplay have? I mean, I would say the main advantage Screenplay has at that point, good page object versus good Screenplay, is that Screenplay isn't just limited to your UI level, right? It could be any kind of interaction, REST API, database, config, command line. So it is really a nice uniform way of handling any kind of interaction, and then share it provides a nice convenient dependency injection mechanism to share any sort of data or results between different kinds of interactions too, which is really nice. So that would be what I would say is kind of one advantage of Screenplay, given you have two good implementations. However, like I will also say, if you abstract out certain things like the synchronization and the automatic weighting and all that, in my opinion, Screenplay becomes less necessary. And here's an example I want to give this. When I did my previous project at my previous company, it was .NET. At the time, we started, WebDriver was king. Cypress was brand new, and we decided we're not using it because it doesn't support IE. And so, knowing I had to use Selenium WebDriver, knowing past nightmares I had with flaky tests and with page object pain, I saw the Screenplay as a way to not only have these scalable kinds of interactions, these very declarative kinds of operations, but also to handle the pain points of things like automatic weighting and all that, because there was no layer waiter, at least that I knew of in .NET at the time. And so, one of the big values of Constrictor in that project at that previous company was the fact that it could handle all of that together, right? It was a one-stop shop for all that kind of behavior stuff, going from low level to high level, which is really nice. More recently, I've picked up Playwright. I started using that mostly in Python, but I've also done it JavaScript as well as Java. Still haven't done it in .NET yet. That's just a matter of time before I get there. But something I realized in Playwright is a browser automation tool, and that it does all the same kinds of stuff in Selenium. WebDriver but it provides refinement to those kinds of interactions. Like it handles waiting automatically, right? It does a bunch of other things too. For me, that was a big one. And so when I click, I can trust that click to be to be safe, right? That I don't have to explicitly say, wait for this thing to appear before it appears. And so just like that, all of lower level interactions that I made in Boa Constrictor around WebDriver, I realized we didn't need to do that with a tool like Playwright because Playwright already handled that. And I don't really know Water, but Titus, based on what you were saying, it sounds like Water kind of does the same type of things. Like it's that nice wrapper around Selenium that makes it do things as you would expect, and you can keep it very tight and performant. And so if you have that layer in there, right, or you have the protections already built in the tool, like something with Playwright, then I have found that Screenplay is not as necessary. While in the C# world and what I did before, I would say absolutely, I can't imagine life without it.
Yeah. So here we go. Like both of us like to talk so much that it's gonna be hard to answer questions, but I wanted to say a couple quick things. Comparing Playwright and Selenium, or Playwright and Cypress and Selenium, is difficult because Selenium is not designed as a testing tool. Selenium 1 was, but the WebDriver implementation is designed as browser automation, like a toolkit for you to write your test automation logic on top of that, which is exactly what Water does. It tries to do all of the opinionated things that make sense for 99% of testers. And if I can try and summarize a little bit what I'm hearing of the Screenplay versus the page object, I will agree that page object has a lot more variability similar to Selenium itself, right? Like they're tools or patterns that you can do a really bad job with, or you can build up something that's really impressive and very maintainable and all the rest. So it kind of comes down to what opinions the specific Screenplay tool is making. And it sounds like the opinions from Boa Constrictor are they sound better than some of the other conventions and guide rails that I've seen in other implementations. And I also think that it's both good and bad. Like when you get something that's opinionated, every opinion you make is pulling away options to do something different. And so Cypress and Playwright are both one idea for how to write tests and do things. And they necessarily preclude other approaches for doing it. But by and large, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that we're finding in the industry that people need more guardrails. People need more assistance by and large to do some of these things. And so I wish we were able to talk more tool versus tool rather than pattern versus pattern to a certain extent. And one of the things that I'm working on, it's not public yet, things that I'm trying to do and things that we're just trying to do on the Selenium team in general is try and locate projects that use Selenium that provide this test layer on top of the browser automation toolkit, trying to find people that have solved something in the space and have made it open source. Because really, each of the Selenium users should be coming and trying to reinvent the wheel from scratch. And Water only exists in Ruby. And so if you're not using Ruby, you don't have the same protections that tool provides for you. You have to write it yourself. And everyone seems to be writing their own rather than trying to collaborate on additional resources. So we in the Selenium team, the Selenium leadership, are trying to find ways to address that. And hopefully there'll be some more announcements and information and things that we're trying to do going forward. If anyone listening has an open source tool that they're using that you've written that you're proud of that solves problems in the space, let me know. We've got a form I'll send you to fill out so that we can kind of keep track of all of that. So I'll stop there.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you guys. It's such an amazing conversation. Let me open it up to Q&A because I feel bad for holding up Andy away from his Volkswagen remodeling. Does anyone have questions for Titus or Andy before we wrap things up here? You can use the little heart emoji at the bottom and just kind of raise your hand like this, and then I can make you speaker, and then you can ask a question live. Bueller.
Everyone's asleep because Andy and I talk so much.
You guys woke me up. This conversation is getting super interesting. Still kind of trying to figure out what are advantages and disadvantages of both, but it almost sounds like no, and I don't even. There we go. We got some questions. I don't want to start a new thread here. We got Osama here. Osama, go ahead and ask your question, please.
I'm audible?
Hey, Osama.
Yeah.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
Can we use both patterns at the same project at the same time, like page object model and screenplay at the same time, getting locators in screenplay pattern from the page object model, things like that?
So in theory, you could use page object model and screenplay in the same project. I would strongly recommend against that. I would say pick one or the other. Otherwise, it's going to be awkward. It's going to be confusing for somebody coming into the project.
So,
I mean, I suppose you could have some tests use one and other tests use the other way. I suppose you could even have it at step level, but that is something that if I were to see that, I would be frightened.
So how we are managing objects in page objects in screenplay pattern? Are we getting any repository there? Object repository?
Like when we use screenplay, we're not using page objects. Like it's a completely different design pattern. So we still model the page with locators, and I put all my locators for a particular class or view, for a particular page or view in its own class, but it's not using page objects.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Hey, Osama, to you and anyone, by the way, great question, Osama. That was a question that I had too. For anyone curious, I did share Andy's boa constrictor repository, and I even grabbed one of his code examples, his test screenplay pattern, and I dropped it in the thread related to this Twitter space. So take a look there. I hope that it'll answer your question. Actually, I started to look into it myself to see how Andy is interacting with the UI. So hopefully that helps someone else. But get another speaker here. Hey, Jigesh, you can go ahead and ask your question, please.
I'm using page object model framework as of now for my application.
Hey, Jigesh, I think we lost you. We started hearing you talking about page object framework, and then you disappeared.
Something like screenplay, or I should stick to page object model only. For a data-driven kind of automation framework, or I can stick to the page object model. Hope you got my question.
I heard data-driven testing and page object model, and I'll speak to that briefly, and you can tell me if I got your question. But I actually don't love data-driven testing specifically with a page object model. But again, this is something that I see a lot of manual testers that transition to Selenium testing, and then kind of try and model their tests. You end up with a whole bunch of tests that try a whole bunch of different combinations of data. I see this in BDD examples where you just have this huge table of data that you're trying. And, that's one way to reuse the methods in a page object is to throw a bunch of different data objects at it and see if the expected responses happen. And if you have access to an API layer, that is a much better way to test setting state through combinations and permutations of different data. So while you can do that with a page object, and that does, promote reuse of, a method in a page object, that's probably not the most maintainable way to get the results that you're actually looking for.
Yeah, but unfortunately, we don't have a API-based system. So R is like, you can say we have something like .NET application, and it's like component-driven rather than an API-driven. So that is where I'm struggling.
Yeah, that's super frustrating. And actually, Andy, that is a good question. Does Screenplay manage like combinations and permutations of data? Well, like how? I know you've got like a dependency injection kind of a thing. Does that data get stored in some kind of serialized format, then you're just running the same action against it, or do you have to write different interactions for that?
Well, with Screenplay, I mean, you can kind of define what that looks like, right? You could, make plain old whatever objects, pass them through. You could try to parameterize it like a test case level and just inject those in and pass them along.
Okay. Do we have any repository or any code example for this where they can just go through and maybe give it a try?
For the Screenplay pattern, if you go to the boa constrictor repository, you can get a link there to the official doc site, and we have a full tutorial where we walk through code together.
Sure. Thanks. We'll definitely have a look at it. Thanks for the info.
And for page objects, I know I have a few resources. Titus, do you want to point anyone to good page object implementations that you might know of?
I probably should have come prepared for this question. The stuff that I have used that's really good is Ruby only, and it's I guess it's usable. There was a little thing on page sections that I wanted to add to it, but water drops is a Ruby implementation of page objects it's a 1-page implementation of page objects because of all of the magic that Ruby gives you. But honestly, if you're interested in hearing about page object patterns and some of the things that I recommend doing and not doing, I do have that advanced Selenium course that I taught that includes examples of page objects. That's actually probably the best. So you can let me send you the link to the latest version of that. But also you can find my presentations out there on what goes into good and bad. It's got code examples, even if it's not all in one repo.
Sounds great, Titus. I've shared one of your YouTube talks I found about page object. But yeah, if you just want to drop the link to the repo in our Twitter space thread for everybody, that would be wonderful. Does anyone have any other questions for Andy or Titus? By the way, Andy, Titus, I know we're at like almost an hour and 40 minutes, which is awesome. Thank you both so much for tuning in, especially Andy on your PTO. So if you guys want to, drop off at any point, you definitely can. But if you want to hang out longer, I think everybody's happy to keep asking all questions. Hey, Patrick, go ahead. I think you can go ahead and ask your question.
Because it's more like a remark, because it's great to hear both sides of the page object and the screener pattern, because when you have only one vision of one specific pattern, of course, you reduce the visibility. And now I will experience more the pattern of the screenplay, because when I read the doc for the first time, I was a little bit overwhelmed, because with the type of tests I'm doing with the page object model, considering the fact that I have multiple contexts, like I said, for managing the province and language and so on and so forth. So I believe that the screenplay pattern could be a little bit cumbersome, but I will give a proper try. And then, of course, regarding the page object model with the synchronization, I heard lots of comments regarding the flakiness of the synchronization. And that's why I will eventually put the solution I put in place at work open source. So eventually, the thing I will remember from this specific cover sessions today is the fact that there is no page object model standards. So everyone put in place a solution to bring the page object patterns, but there is no actual standard. And I was quite surprised to know that. And I think if we want to make the page object model clearer and, of course, make it more maintainable, I think this is something we should work on. And I think also the screenplay pattern have a role to make the interactions. So I think both patterns are great, but I think depending on the type of application we need to test and the type of test strategy, I think both the patterns are relevant. So that's my opinion.
Cool. Thanks so much, Pat. I think I see 52. You also requested to ask a question? Please go ahead.
I did. Thanks, Nikolay, for hosting, and thank you, Pandy and Titus, for your talks on the different models. My question is a quick one. Is there any documentation out there for transferring an existing page object framework to Screenplay?
So, funny you ask. About, what was it? A year ago, maybe? I can't remember when it was, but sometime in the not too distant past, I teamed up with Sabotage Andy from SpecFlow, and we did a live stream where we converted a .NET project from, I forget if it was page objects or raw calls or driver pattern. It was one of those into Screenplay. I can share the link with Nikolay and he can send it out. It's a rather long live stream. It's about 2 hours, but basically Sabotage Andy was driving and he had never done Screenplay or Boa Constrictor before. And he came out of that session with his mind blown. He thought it was the greatest thing ever. So that's the best resource I have on showing how to do that. And I'd be more than happy to share it.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, 52. Anyone else have some questions for Andy or Titus? One thing that I feel like I definitely heard from this talk is that we need a standardized library for implementing page objects or some kind of a good testing pattern with page objects. And I was actually been pitching that to Titus. I'm like, hey, the Selenium community should come out with something that helps to encourage good practices in terms of page objects, but they're so busy with everything that they already have to do that I hope one day.
Well,
they're out
I mean,
to do it.
part of this is also, there one, limited resources for Selenium, and two, we're intentionally trying not to be opinionated. We, like Selenium put out the page factory pattern, and it was horribly abused by everyone, and everyone in the Selenium team is just like, that was a horrible idea that we put out the page factory. And it would be nice to be able to work with the community and trying to work with maintainers of open source projects, provide alternatives for people. So like, here's 4 options in Java that each solve things slightly different ways. Which one makes the most sense for your team? And hey, when you adopt it for your team, can you contribute back? If you improve something, make a PR with that improvement kind of a thing, and try to be more collaborative. Like we're not fully taking advantage of the open source system that we have, the ecosystem we're in. Like Cypress and Playwright, okay, they're open source, quote unquote, but they've got companies driving them, and they're not community driven, and they're not, there is gatekeeping in both of those projects. That's not open web focused, is how I'll put it. So anyway, it's hard for, like, if I had all the time in the world, I absolutely, like, the thing I would love the most is to put together a page object implementation with like element wrappers and browser wrappers in all of the different languages. But it's not something I have all the time in the world to do, unfortunately. And there's just a lot of stuff I'm trying to do to get Selenium working and out the door. And they got 4.2 out last month and 4.3 out last week, and hard at work at 4.4 now. So it's just kind of trying to work on the things that affect the most people right now is kind of how I'm trying to do things. Even though there is a need in the community for more test logic wrappers on top of Selenium for the Selenium solutions to be successful.
And you're also working on merging Selenium and Appium together, right?
Well, that was a proposal I made that is not getting the resources it needs, so it's kind of out of scope for the resources we have. I would love to make it easier for Selenium developers to write Appium code in the same code base, because each of the languages take slightly different approaches to how it works, and there's just never been the kind of communication that we should have had between the two projects. So there's little differences between both of the projects that make it more difficult than it should be to do the things that we want to do in both. But that's that's on a list of things that'd be nice to do that's not in the near future.
Yeah, definitely would be awesome. I saw a Paul. Do you have a question?
Less of a question, more of just helpful info. I do have an open source framework for .NET that handles a lot of the abstraction and things around weighting that y'all were talking about earlier. So I will send that to Nikolay and he can post it out because I'm not quite sure how. I know use spaces very much and it doesn't look like I can post directly into here. The other thing is I've had an approach that I've used for a while where we stack. We think less about frameworks and think more of stacks. So I'm going to post that out as well. I'm going to copy Nikolay and Pandy and Titus on it, and maybe we can have sort of a separate Twitterized discussion on that because it does handle some of the things that we're talking about here, not a pattern so much as a way of delineating layers in the software. Does that sound helpful to you?
That sounds super helpful to me, Paul. I think more resources, kind of as Titus hinted at, like open source resources that are doing this, but then also even more ideas is better for everybody. And we can potentially even do a totally new Twitter space out of this, depending on what comes out of that conversation.
Yeah, happy to do it. Yeah, so I'll send that on to you later today, and then we'll see where that goes.
Sounds amazing, Paul. Thanks so much for chiming in.
Hey, and thank y'all so much for the time. It's been cool. I've enjoyed this.
Happy to hear it. All right, then we got Jigesh. I think you had another question.
Yeah. So another question is around what if we want to automate the test across different browsers and devices? So in that case, which pattern would be an effective one, screenplay or page objects? Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, Jigesh, I heard you. Andy, Titus, any thoughts?
I'm sorry, my phone broke up. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So if I want to implement my test so that I can execute it across different browsers, different devices, right? So in that case, which pattern can prove to be an effective one, page object or screenplay?
Well, I mean, when it comes to cross-browser testing, honestly, I would say that is a separate concern from interaction. So either pattern is going to be fine. The pattern is not going to weigh in on that. What I would say is like the way I would handle cross-browser testing would be I would pass my target browser into the automation as an input and then have all the tests in my suite run against that. You want to run against a different browser, make a separate launch, change the browser that you're targeting and run again. So that's something where it's not something that the pattern is going to give you advantage or disadvantage on.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, just to add to what is saying in terms of doing cross-browser testing, one thing that I feel like people don't want to fall into is to prefer cross-browser functionality testing over more functional testing. I think rather than, writing 10 tests and then running them across 3 browsers, it's better to spend the same amount of effort and try to get a little bit more functional coverage on one browser versus, multiple browsers. I think, that's not always true, but I found that to be true in a lot of cases, especially nowadays with browsers being so similar, especially like, Chrome and Edge running on the same rendering engine. Safari and Chrome are still relatively different. So the differences that arise are typically rendering differences. So that is something is good for visual testing. But if we're talking about functional testing, I would say nowadays, running all your functional tests on all the browsers is likely redundant and likely won't produce any kind of functionally different bugs. And so I just wanted to mention that. And Titus, Andy, let me know if you all have any thoughts or you disagree with that for some reason.
I mean, I've definitely come across bugs that were browser specific. So, and I think it's also important to note that there are a lot of companies that require cross-browser. They tell their investors, we're testing these things cross-browser. And so I do think that it's important to be able to run your tests in a cross-browser way. But I agree with Andy that the pattern that you're using to do that is independent. Because again, page object pattern, you're passing in, you create a driver in your book workbook, you pass it into your page object, and the pattern that you're using for it does not matter. Just the generation of it happens in a different place.
Okay.
Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andy. Were you going to speak?
Yeah. I just got to say, I need to drop off now. Thank you for inviting me, Nikolay. Titus, thank you for being the counterweight. This has been an awesome discussion. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. I really appreciate it.
Andy, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate you taking some time during your PTO and during your Volkswagen remodeling for all of us. Where can everybody learn more about you?
Best place to find out more about me would be automationpanda.com or at automationpanda on Twitter.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Andy. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
thank
you. Can stick around, Titus. If you're okay, stick around for a little bit more. I don't know if anyone else has any questions for Titus. If not, we can all go on about our day.
It's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Does anyone have any last minute questions for Titus?
All right. Now that Andy isn't here, let me talk about it.
Tell us how you really feel, Titus.
No, this was great. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us, and appreciate it. Yeah.
Titus, where can people learn more about you?
TitusFortner.com has all of my info, and when I can find time to write blog posts, I put stuff there, or follow me on Twitter at Titus Fortner.
Awesome. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. So just wanted to say thanks again to you, Titus, for taking time out of your day to explain to all of us, your thoughts on these ideas. Hopefully it seemed like it created some really great ideas, even some new collaboration opportunities, which is really exciting for all of us. And thanks to all of the listeners for spending time with us, spending almost 2 hours today listening to our conversation. We hope that it has provided some value to you all. If you want to learn anything new in the future, want to hear anything more about some other topics, you can just respond to this Twitter thread here and let me know, and I'll try to host another Twitter space around those topics in the future. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Nikolay.
Yeah. Bye, Titus. Talk to you later.